Tonight, we turn our attention to a figure whose life was intricately woven into the fabric of two great ancient powers, Egypt and Rome. Her existence was not merely a personal journey, but a profound intersection of empires, a story unfolding amidst the grand shifting alliances and political upheaval that defined the late Roman Republic. She was a woman who, through a rare combination of sharp intellect, captivating charisma, and an unyielding strategic will, navigated this complex world, striving to preserve the ancient kingdom of Egypt. Her path led her to engage with the most powerful and influential men of her age, figures whose decisions shaped the destiny of the Mediterranean world, and in doing so, she left an indelible mark on the vast tapestry of history. She was a figure of remarkable complexity and multifaceted talents, a ruler fluent in a multitude of tongues, a devoted mother, a shrewd diplomat, and a formidable opponent on the political and military stage. Yet, even centuries after her reign, the echoes of her life continue to resonate, shaping our understanding of a pivotal era and contributing to the enduring allure of ancient Egypt. This is the story of Cleopatra. The city of Alexandria, on the northern coast of Egypt, was more than just a capital. It was a beacon of Hellenistic culture, a vibrant metropolis that had been founded centuries earlier by Alexander the Great himself, envisioned as a bridge between East and West. Here, amidst its bustling harbours and grand avenues, in 69 BC, Cleopatra VII was born into the Ptolemaic dynasty. This was a line of Greek kings and queens, descendants of Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander's most trusted generals, who had claimed Egypt as his share of the immense empire after Alexander's death. For nearly 3 centuries, these Ptolemies had maintained a unique and often precarious blend of Greek and Egyptian traditions, ruling over a land with an ancient, deeply rooted indigenous culture, while upholding their own Macedonian heritage. Alexandria, under their patronage, had transformed into the intellectual and commercial heart of the Hellenistic world, renowned not only for its magnificent library, a priceless repository of ancient knowledge that attracted scholars from across the globe, but also for its towering lighthouse of Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, guiding ships to its prosperous ports. The Ptolemaic court, despite its outward splendor and sophisticated learning, was also a place of ruthless political intrigue, where siblings often vied for power with deadly ambition, and the succession to the throne was rarely peaceful, frequently decided by assassination or civil war. Cleopatra's father was Ptolemy XII Auletes, a king whose reign was characterized by weakness, a lack of firm authority, and a desperate, often humiliating struggle to maintain his throne amidst internal dissent and the ever-encroaching shadow of the mighty Roman Republic. Known for his love of music and revelry, more than for statesmanship, Auletes was often forced to pay immense sums of Egypt's wealth to influential Roman politicians and generals to secure their dubious support and prevent Roman annexation, a testament to Egypt's rapidly declining independence and its vulnerability to the rising power of Rome. At one point he was even exiled from Egypt by his own people, fleeing to Rome to plead for his restoration. This was a period of instability that affected the young Cleopatra, exposing her early to the precarious nature of power, the fickle loyalties of courts, and the overwhelming undeniable influence of the Roman Republic. She would have observed firsthand the intricate dance of diplomacy, the corrupting power of bribery, and the undeniable might of Roman legions that characterized Roman foreign policy, lessons she would carry with her into her own reign. From a very young age, Cleopatra distinguished herself within the Ptolemaic royal family through her extraordinary intellect, her insatiable curiosity, and her remarkable linguistic abilities, setting her apart from her less gifted siblings. Unlike many of her Ptolemaic predecessors, who, content with their Greek heritage, rarely bothered to learn the language of the ancient land they ruled, Cleopatra made a deliberate and politically astute effort to become fluent in Egyptian. This was a powerful symbol of respect and connection to her subjects, allowing her to communicate directly with the priests and common people, fostering a loyalty that her forebears often lacked. Beyond Egyptian, she was also proficient in Greek, the language of her dynasty and of Hellenistic scholarship, as well as Latin, the language of the rising Roman power, and likely Hebrew, Aramaic, and several other languages of the diverse Eastern Mediterranean. This linguistic mastery made her a uniquely formidable diplomat, capable of conversing directly and persuasively with foreign envoys and potentates without the need for interpreters, a significant advantage in an age of complex international relations. Her education would have encompassed not only rhetoric and philosophy, but also mathematics, astronomy, and a deep understanding of the intricate politics, economics, and agricultural systems of her kingdom, preparing her comprehensively for the great complexities of governance. She possessed a keen understanding of her family's often bloody history, the strategic importance of Egypt's unparalleled grain wealth to the Roman world, and the delicate balance required to maintain her dynasty's independence in a world increasingly dominated by the insatiable appetite of Rome. Upon the death of her father, Ptolemy XII Auletes, in 51 BC, Cleopatra, then just 18 years old, ascended to the throne, inheriting a kingdom burdened by debt and internal strife. She was to rule jointly with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was only 10 years old. This joint rule, a common but often disastrous Ptolemaic practice, was almost invariably a recipe for conflict, as powerful court eunuchs, ambitious generals, and regents manipulated the young co-rulers for their own gain. Almost immediately, tensions arose between the strong-willed Cleopatra and the regents who advised the young Ptolemy XIII, particularly the eunuch Pothinus and the general Achilles. Her independent mind, her desire for sole power, and her attempts to assert her authority clashed directly with their desire to control the kingdom and its wealth. The political instability within the Alexandrian court escalated rapidly, fueled by the ambitions of those around her brother, who saw her as a threat to their influence. The escalating conflict culminated in Cleopatra's forced exile from Alexandria, a desperate measure taken by her brother's faction to remove her from power. She fled to Syria, a region where she had some support, and there she began to gather an army of mercenaries, determined to reclaim her rightful place on the throne through military force if necessary. This period of exile, though a severe setback and personally dangerous, further honed her resolve, sharpened her political instincts, and deepened her understanding of military strategy and the practicalities of raising and commanding an army. She was not content to merely be a figurehead queen, manipulated by advisors. She was a queen who would fight fiercely for her power and the sovereignty of her kingdom. The stage was now set for a dramatic confrontation, one that would soon involve the most powerful man in the Roman world, Julius Caesar, whose own sprawling civil war was about to spill onto Egyptian shores, irrevocably altering the destiny of Cleopatra and her ancient land. The tumultuous currents of Roman civil war, which had engulfed the Republic for years in a brutal struggle for supremacy, finally reached the shores of Egypt in the autumn of 48 BC. Julius Caesar, having decisively defeated his rival Pompey the Great at the pivotal Battle of Phaselis in Greece, pursued Pompey across the Mediterranean to Egypt, expecting to find him seeking refuge there. Caesar's arrival in Alexandria, with only a relatively small contingent of veteran soldiers, plunged the already unstable Ptolemaic court into further disarray and heightened tension. Pompey, seeking asylum from his former friend and now relentless enemy, had been treacherously assassinated by agents of Ptolemy XIII, who hoped to curry favour with the victorious Caesar. This act, however, offended Caesar, who viewed it not as a service, but as a violation of Roman dignity, a barbaric act against a former consul, and a betrayal of a man who had once been his son-in-law. He immediately asserted his authority in Alexandria, taking up residence in the royal palace and demanding repayment of the debts owed to Rome by the Ptolemaic kings, effectively positioning himself as the arbiter of Egyptian affairs. At this critical juncture, with Caesar now firmly ensconced in the palace, Cleopatra, who had been exiled and was diligently gathering her forces on Egypt's border, saw an unparalleled and perhaps final opportunity to reclaim her throne. She knew that gaining Caesar's direct support was her only viable path back to power, as her brother and his powerful advisors controlled access to the palace and would prevent any direct approach. According to the famous and often retold account, she devised a daring and audacious plan. She had herself smuggled into the heavily guarded palace, reportedly rolled up inside a large carpet or a laundry sack, and delivered directly to Caesar's private chambers. This dramatic and unexpected entrance a testament to her courage and ingenuity, immediately captured Caesar's attention and imagination. The meeting that followed marked the beginning of their extraordinary alliance and a deep personal relationship that would shape the course of both their lives and, indeed, the destiny of Egypt and the Roman world. Cleopatra, with her sharp intellect, her remarkable linguistic prowess, and her captivating charisma, quickly captivated Caesar, a man known for his keen judgment of character and his own insatiable ambition. She presented her case for the throne with compelling arguments, highlighting the injustices she had suffered, the instability caused by her brother's corrupt regents, and the benefits of a strong, stable Egypt allied with Rome. Caesar, ever the pragmatist and a master of political calculation, recognized the significant strategic value of a stable, pro-Roman ruler in Egypt, a land whose grain supply was absolutely vital for feeding Rome's populace and its armies. He declared his intention to mediate the dispute between Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII, effectively siding with the Queen and asserting Roman authority over the Ptolemaic succession. This intervention, however, ignited what became known as the Alexandrian War, a fierce and unexpected conflict within the very heart of the city itself. The Alexandrian War was a brutal and destructive urban conflict, a chaotic struggle for control of the city's strategic points and its royal palace. Ptolemy XIII's forces, led by his general Achilles and the eunuch Pothinus, besieged Caesar and Cleopatra within the royal palace complex, turning the grand seat of power into a fortified stronghold. The fighting was intense, characterized by desperate street battles, skirmishes in the narrow alleys, and fierce naval engagements in Alexandria's bustling harbour. During the prolonged conflict, a significant portion of the Great Library of Alexandria, a priceless repository of ancient knowledge and a symbol of Hellenistic learning, was tragically damaged or destroyed. This devastating loss reportedly occurred when Caesar, in a desperate tactical move, ordered the burning of ships in the harbour to prevent them from falling into enemy hands, and the flames inadvertently spread to nearby warehouses and parts of the library complex, consuming irreplaceable scrolls and texts. The war dragged on for months, with Caesar's small isolated force often in peril, facing overwhelming numbers until crucial Roman reinforcements finally arrived, turning the tide of the conflict. The decisive moment came with the Battle of the Nile, a final confrontation that broke Ptolemy XIII's resistance. Attempting to escape across the river, he tragically drowned, bringing a definitive end to his challenge to Cleopatra's rule. With her brother's death, Cleopatra's claim to the throne was solidified and undisputed. Caesar, having secured her position through military intervention, formally declared her the rightful ruler of Egypt. She was then installed as co-ruler with her youngest brother, Ptolemy XIV, a mere figurehead whom she could easily control. Her alliance with Caesar was now absolute, a bond forged in the crucible of war, and her power in Egypt was firmly established under Roman protection, ensuring Roman interests in the wealthy kingdom. In June of 47 BC, a little over a year after their first meeting, Cleopatra gave birth to a son, whom she named Ptolemy Caesar, but who became widely known as Caesarion, Little Caesar. Though Caesar never officially acknowledged him as his son in Rome for political reasons, his birth further cemented the personal and political ties between the formidable Roman general and the ambitious Egyptian queen, creating a living symbol of their powerful and controversial union. Caesar remained in Egypt for several more months, consolidating Cleopatra's rule and enjoying the opulent and intellectually stimulating life of the Ptolemaic court, before finally returning to Rome to address other pressing challenges in his sprawling civil war, leaving Cleopatra firmly in command of Egypt. Following Julius Caesar's departure from Egypt in 47 BC, a period of relative calm and focused governance began for Cleopatra. She embarked on a determined and astute effort to restore the prosperity and stability of her ancient kingdom, which had been weakened by her father's misrule and the recent civil war. With Caesar's powerful backing and the elimination of her rivals, she was now the undisputed monarch of Egypt, a position she had fought fiercely to reclaim and intended to wield with full authority. Her reign during this time focused on crucial internal reforms aimed at economic recovery and the careful, efficient management of Egypt's agricultural resources, particularly its crucial grain supply. This grain, harvested from the fertile Nile delta, was not only the lifeblood of Egypt, but also a vital commodity for Rome, making Egypt an indispensable economic partner. She oversaw the restoration of temples, demonstrating her respect for and integration with Egyptian religious practices, and meticulously sought to present herself as a legitimate successor to the ancient pharaohs, blending Hellenistic and Egyptian traditions in her public image and royal decrees. Under her astute governance, Egypt once again began to flourish, becoming a wealthy and increasingly influential power in the Eastern Mediterranean, a testament to her administrative capabilities and her deep understanding of her kingdom's needs. In 46 BC, a year after Caesar's return to Rome, Cleopatra made a highly anticipated and politically significant visit to the heart of the Roman Republic. Accompanied by her young son Caesarion and a lavish retinue that included her brother Ptolemy XIV. Her arrival in Rome was not merely a diplomatic visit, it was a carefully orchestrated spectacle that captivated and for many scandalized Roman society in equal measure. Caesar, now the undisputed master of Rome, housed her in his private villa across the Tiber River, treating her with great honor and publicly acknowledging Caesarion, though he refrained from officially declaring him his legal heir to avoid further political complications. Cleopatra's presence in the Roman capital was a powerful statement. She was not merely a client queen, subservient to Rome, but a sovereign ruler, the queen of the wealthiest kingdom in the Mediterranean, allied with Rome's most powerful man. She was presented to Roman senators, prominent citizens, and influential women, showcasing her intelligence, her charm, and her ability to converse in their own language. While many Romans were fascinated by her exotic allure, her vast wealth, and the novelty of a powerful Eastern queen, others, particularly traditionalists and staunch Republicans, viewed her presence with suspicion and disdain, seeing her as a dangerous foreign influence and a symbol of Caesar's increasingly autocratic and monarchical tendencies, which they feared threatened the very foundations of the Republic. The political landscape of Rome, however, remained volatile and unpredictable. On the Ides of March 44 BC, Julius Caesar was brutally assassinated by a conspiracy of senators who feared his growing power and perceived monarchical ambitions, believing they were restoring the Republic. This sudden and violent event sent shockwaves throughout the entire Roman world, plunging the Republic back into the familiar chaos of civil war. For Cleopatra, Caesar's death was a personal and political catastrophe. Her most powerful patron, the father of her son, and the guarantor of her throne, was gone, leaving her vulnerable and her position as queen potentially precarious in the rapidly shifting Roman political climate. She immediately recognized the danger this posed to her, to Caesarion, and to the independence of Egypt. With Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra swiftly returned to Egypt, navigating the treacherous currents of Roman politics from afar, choosing to consolidate her own position rather than immediately intervening in the Roman power struggles. The Roman Republic descended into a new brutal round of civil wars, as Caesar's assassins, led by Brutus and Cassius, clashed with his avengers, primarily Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general, and Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and shrewd political heir. Cleopatra, with remarkable foresight and strategic acumen, maintained a careful neutrality during the early phases of this renewed conflict. She avoided committing her precious Egyptian resources, her formidable navy, her vast treasury, and her indispensable grain supply to either side, instead focusing on strengthening her own kingdom and observing the unfolding power struggles in Rome. With keen interest, she understood that Egypt's wealth and strategic location made it a coveted prize for any Roman faction, and her dynasty's survival depended on making the right alliances at the right time, backing the eventual victor. She watched as the second triumvirate, Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus, formed, consolidating their power and systematically hunting down Caesar's assassins, ultimately defeating them at the Battle of Philippi. The stage was being meticulously set for her next great encounter with a Roman leader, one that would define the final act of her life and irrevocably determine the destiny of her ancient kingdom. The shifting tides of Roman power, following the decisive defeat of Caesar's assassins at the Battle of Philippi, brought Mark Antony, now one of the three most powerful men in the Roman world, to the east in 41 BC. As a triumvir, Antony was tasked with the immense responsibility of reorganizing the eastern provinces, raising substantial funds to pay his veteran legions, and crucially, preparing for a potential long-anticipated campaign against the Parthian Empire, Rome's formidable rival on its eastern frontier. It was in this context that he summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, ostensibly to explain her actions during the recent Roman civil wars and to assess her loyalty to the new triumvirate. What transpired, however, would become one of the most famous and consequential encounters in history, shaping the destinies of both individuals and the empires they represented. Cleopatra, with her innate understanding of spectacle, political theatre, and the subtle psychology of power, approached this summons as a sovereign monarch of an ancient and wealthy kingdom. She arrived in Tarsus by sailing majestically up the Cydnus River on a magnificent gilded barge. Its sails were of royal purple, its oars of burnished silver, moving with a rhythmic splash to the enchanting sound of flutes and lyres, creating an almost dreamlike procession. The air along the riverbanks was heavy with the intoxicating scent of burning incense, and the shores were thronged with astonished spectators, drawn by the sheer grandeur of the display. Cleopatra herself, dressed in the guise of the goddess Aphrodite, reclined under a canopy of gold-embroidered cloth, attended by young boys dressed as cupids and handmaidens as nymphs, embodying a living deity. This grand entrance was a deliberate, meticulously calculated display of wealth, undeniable power, and deep divine association, designed specifically to overwhelm Antony's senses, assert her own majesty, and immediately establish her as an equal, if not superior force. It worked precisely as intended. Antony, who had expected her to arrive as a supplicant, was immediately captivated and irrevocably drawn into her world, his initial political assessment quickly overshadowed by her compelling presence. The meeting in Tarsus and the subsequent days marked the beginning of their deep and politically charged relationship. Cleopatra, far from being merely a beautiful woman, was an intelligent, highly educated, and exceptionally astute ruler, capable of engaging in deep discussions on philosophy, intricate politics, and complex military strategy with Antony on equal terms. She understood his ambitions for glory in the East, his personal weaknesses for luxury and pleasure, and crucially, the resources Egypt could offer to further his grand goals, particularly his Parthian campaign. For Antony, an experienced soldier and a man of strong appetites and a penchant for grand gestures, Cleopatra represented not only exotic allure and intellectual companionship, but also the indispensable key to unlocking the immense wealth, naval power, and strategic depth of Egypt, resources he desperately needed for his eastern endeavors and his ongoing simmering rivalry with Octavian in Rome. Their bond quickly transcended a simple alliance, evolving into a profound partnership. Antony spent the entire winter of 4140 BC in Alexandria with Cleopatra, immersing himself fully in the luxurious and sophisticated life of the Ptolemaic court. This period was marked by lavish banquets, intellectual discussions with Alexandrian scholars, and a shared pursuit of pleasure and revelry, often engaging in playful contests and masquerades. While Antony indulged in the diversions and comforts of Alexandria, Cleopatra ensured that their alliance was solidified through both a deep personal connection and a clear political understanding of their mutual interests. During this time, she conceived twins, Alexander Helios, meaning the sun, and Cleopatra Selene, meaning the moon, whose births further cemented their bond and provided Antony with heirs who were half Egyptian, a symbolic fusion of East and West that underscored their shared vision for a new Eastern power. However, the relentless political realities of the Roman world soon called Antony away from Alexandria. News of renewed civil unrest in Italy, the Perusine War, and the growing increasingly hostile tensions with Octavian forced his reluctant return to Rome. In a move of calculated political expediency and a desperate attempt to mend his strained relationship with Octavian, Antony married Octavia, Octavian's virtuous, influential, and highly respected sister. This marriage, intended to stabilize the fragile triumvirate and present a united front to the Roman populace, was a temporary but significant setback for Cleopatra. She possessed a keen understanding of the pragmatic and often brutal nature of Roman politics. She remained in Egypt, continuing to consolidate her power, manage her prosperous kingdom, and carefully observe the unfolding events in Rome, knowing with certainty that Antony's grand ambitions in the East, particularly his desire for Parthian glory, would eventually bring him back to her, and that Egypt, with its unparalleled resources, remained absolutely indispensable to his grand designs. The stage was meticulously being set for the next, more intense phase of their relationship, one that would increasingly challenge traditional Roman sensibilities, provoke Octavian's ire, and ultimately lead to a final devastating confrontation that would determine the fate of the Roman world and the last independent Hellenistic kingdom. After several years of absence from Egypt, during which he had been engaged in complex Roman political affairs, including his marriage to Octavia and a failed campaign against Parthia, Mark Antony returned to the east in 37 BC. His reunion with Cleopatra in Antioch marked a rekindling of their deep connection with renewed intensity. Antony's strategic focus was now almost entirely on the eastern half of the Roman world, where he aimed to secure his power base, reorganize its vast territories, and crucially, launch a more successful and decisive campaign against the formidable Parthian Empire, Rome's persistent rival on its eastern frontier. For this monumental undertaking, the wealth, the highly organized logistical capabilities, and the naval power of Egypt, all firmly controlled by Cleopatra, were absolutely indispensable. Their relationship deepened significantly, becoming not merely a personal bond, but a deep and interwoven political, military and economic partnership, with Cleopatra effectively becoming his primary patron and strategic advisor in the East. She provided Antony with the financial resources he needed to pay his legions, the naval support to transport his armies, and the critical grain supplies to feed his troops, demonstrating her indispensable role in his imperial ambitions. The height of Cleopatra's influence over Antony, and the most provocative demonstration of their shared vision for the East, occurred with the donations of Alexandria in 34 BC. This was a grand public ceremony held in Alexandria, a deliberate and audacious display of power and a direct challenge to Roman traditions and Octavian's authority. Antony, dressed in the attire of the god Dionysus, and Cleopatra, arrayed as the powerful Egyptian goddess Isis, sat on magnificent golden thrones, embodying divine authority. Before a vast crowd of Alexandrians and Roman dignitaries, Antony publicly declared Cleopatra the Queen of Kings and Queen of Egypt and Cyprus, Libya and Coele-Syria, formally acknowledging her dominion over a vast swath of territory. More significantly, he proceeded to distribute immense Roman-controlled territories in the east to Cleopatra and their children. Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, was proclaimed King of Kings and co-ruler with his mother, and most controversially, was formally declared the legitimate son and heir of Julius Caesar, a direct and undeniable affront to Octavian, who was Caesar's adopted son and official heir. Their twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, were also given kingdoms. Alexander Helios was granted Armenia, Media, and Parthia, territories Antony hoped to conquer, while Cleopatra Selene received Cyrenaica and Libya. A fourth child, Ptolemy Philadelphus, born later, was also designated for future rule. These declarations effectively carved out a vast Hellenistic empire under the nominal rule of Cleopatra's children, with Alexandria, as its new imperial centre, clearly challenging Rome's traditional dominance. This audacious act caused widespread outrage and scandal in Rome, where news of the donations was met with fury and disbelief. Octavian, who had been carefully consolidating his power in the West and cultivating an image of traditional Roman virtue, seized upon the donations as a devastating propaganda tool. He launched a relentless and highly effective campaign, portraying Antony not as a Roman general, but as a man utterly corrupted by Eastern luxury, seduced by a dangerous foreign queen, and a traitor to Roman values and the very integrity of the Republic. Antony was depicted as Cleopatra's puppet, abandoning his Roman identity, his Roman wife Octavia, and betraying his homeland for an exotic, ambitious foreign monarch. Octavian skillfully manipulated public opinion, portraying the donations as an attempt to dismember the Roman Empire, establish an Eastern monarchy with Alexandria as its capital, and place Cleopatra and Caesarion as its rulers, thereby undermining Rome's supremacy. This propaganda was incredibly effective, turning much of Roman sentiment against Antony and Cleopatra, painting them as a decadent, Oriental threat to Roman liberty and order. Cleopatra's influence over Antony's policies and military plans grew undeniably in the years leading up to the final conflict. She was no longer merely a consort. She was an active, intelligent, and indispensable partner in governance and strategy, often accompanying him on campaigns and advising him on crucial diplomatic and logistical matters. Her deep understanding of Eastern politics, her vast wealth, and her clear strategic vision became central to Antony's operations, particularly his renewed preparations for a Parthian campaign and his broader ambitions in the East. She was present at his war councils, and her fleet and treasury were integrated into his military machine. This increasing integration of Cleopatra into Antony's Roman affairs, however, further fueled Octavian's narrative that Antony had abandoned his Roman duty and was now fully under the sway of an ambitious foreign queen who sought to establish a personal empire at Rome's expense. The donations of Alexandria thus became a pivotal and irreversible moment, making the inevitable conflict between Antony and Octavian, between the Roman West and the Hellenistic East, almost unavoidable. The public declarations and territorial distributions were a direct challenge to Octavian's authority, his legitimacy as Caesar's heir, and his vision for the future of Rome. Both sides understood the stakes were existential and began to prepare for the final decisive confrontation, assembling vast armies and navies across the Mediterranean. The fate of the Roman world, and indeed the future of Egypt and the last vestiges of Hellenistic independence, now hung precariously on the outcome of this impending clash. The tension mounted across the ancient world, a quiet hum of expectation before the storm, a final reckoning for the Roman Republic. The escalating rivalry between Mark Antony and Octavian, fueled by the provocative donations of Alexandria and Octavian's relentless and highly effective propaganda campaign, finally erupted into open conflict, a struggle that would determine the sole master of the Roman world. Octavian, ever the astute politician and master of legalistic maneuvering, understood that declaring war directly on Antony, a fellow Roman triumvir, would be politically problematic and could alienate parts of the Roman populace and Senate. Instead, he skillfully orchestrated events in Rome, securing a declaration of war on Cleopatra herself, framing the conflict not as a civil war among Romans, but as a defense of Roman honor and tradition against a dangerous foreign queen who sought to dominate Rome through her corrupting influence over Antony. This clever legalistic maneuver allowed Octavian to rally Roman sentiment against Cleopatra, portraying her as the primary aggressor and a grave threat to the Republic's very existence, a narrative that resonated deeply with traditional Roman values. The stage for the climactic confrontation was meticulously set in the Ionian Sea, off the coast of Actium in western Greece, near a narrow strait that offered strategic advantages. Both sides amassed forces, particularly vast fleets, recognizing that naval supremacy would be key. Antony and Cleopatra combined their naval power, bringing together the formidable ships of Egypt, the Roman East, and various allied kingdoms, forming a fleet of over 500 warships, including many large, heavily armed vessels. Octavian, commanding the forces of Rome's western provinces, also assembled an immense fleet of comparable size, though his ships were generally smaller and more agile, led by his skilled and experienced Admiral Agrippa. The build-up to the battle was a period of intense strategic maneuvering, with both sides attempting to gain a tactical advantage, block supply lines, and demoralize the enemy. Antony and Cleopatra, despite some of Antony's veteran generals advising a land engagement, where their larger army might have an advantage, chose to engage in a naval battle, believing their larger ships and superior numbers at sea would be decisive in the confined waters. The Battle of Actium, fought on September 20, 30 BC, was a massive and chaotic naval engagement, a clash of hundreds of ships that would decide the fate of the Roman world. The two fleets maneuvered for position in the narrow strait, their oars churning the water, their ramming prows seeking to shatter enemy hulls. Antony and Cleopatra's ships, though generally larger and more heavily armed, were less maneuverable in the close quarters of the battle. Octavian's fleet, under Agrippa's command, employed tactics of speed, precision, and coordinated attacks, using their smaller, swifter vessels to outflank and isolate Antony's heavier ships. The battle raged for hours, a brutal and deafening clash of splintering wood, snapping oars, the clang of weapons, and the cries of men. In the midst of the battle, As the fighting was still undecided and fiercely contested, Cleopatra, commanding her squadron of 60 Egyptian ships, made a controversial and ultimately disastrous decision. She broke through the Roman lines and sailed away from the engagement, heading swiftly south towards Egypt, her ships laden with her treasury. Her reasons for this sudden and unexpected withdrawal remain debated by historians to this day. Some suggest it was a prearranged plan to escape if defeat seemed imminent, to preserve her fleet and her life, and to regroup in Egypt. Others argue it was a desperate, impulsive attempt to break free from the entanglement of the battle and save her valuable treasury ships, which were crucial for any future resistance. Regardless of the precise intent, Antony, witnessing Cleopatra's ships retreating and perhaps believing the battle lost, abandoned his own command and followed her, leaving his remaining fleet and army to their fate. This act of apparent desertion by their commander demoralized his forces, leading to the complete collapse of his fleet, which was either captured or destroyed, and the eventual surrender of his land army, which had been waiting on shore. The defeat at Actium was devastating for Antony and Cleopatra, a catastrophic loss that effectively sealed their fate and marked the end of their ambitions for control of the Roman world. Their flight back to Egypt was a desperate and somber retreat, a journey filled with despair and the grim realization of their impending doom. They attempted to rally remaining forces, to secure new alliances with distant kingdoms, and to prepare for Octavian's inevitable invasion of Egypt, but their efforts were largely futile. Cleopatra even explored the possibility of escaping further, perhaps to India, by dismantling her ships and having them dragged across the desert to the Red Sea. But this desperate plan proved unfeasible. The momentum was now entirely with Octavian, who systematically consolidated his victory. The defeat at Actium was a psychological blow that shattered their power, their prestige, and their remaining hopes. The Roman Republic, after decades of brutal civil strife, was now on the cusp of a new era, with Octavian poised to become its sole master, bringing an end to the long period of civil wars and establishing a new, centralized form of governance that would become the Roman Empire. The fate of Egypt, and its last queen, was now irrevocably tied to the triumph of Rome, a final chapter about to unfold. With the decisive victory at Actium, Octavian's path to undisputed power was clear and unobstructed. He did not hesitate, moving with characteristic speed and precision. In the summer of 30 BC, he launched his invasion of Egypt, systematically advancing towards Alexandria, the last stronghold of Antony and Cleopatra. The once formidable forces of the East, demoralized and fragmented after the crushing defeat at Actium, offered little effective resistance to Octavian's disciplined legions. Antony, in a desperate and ultimately futile attempt to regain his military standing and salvage some honor, launched a final small-scale attack against Octavian's advancing legions outside Alexandria. This last effort failed decisively. His remaining troops deserted him, and he was left with no recourse. Facing utter defeat, profound humiliation, and the certainty of capture, Mark Antony, believing Cleopatra to be already dead from a false report, fell upon his own sword. Taking his own life was a tragic and dramatic end of a man who had once been one of Rome's most powerful figures, a triumvir who had commanded legions and vast territories. He was brought, still alive but mortally wounded, to Cleopatra, who had barricaded herself in a monument she had constructed, perhaps a tomb or a fortified mausoleum. He died in her arms, a poignant and final moment between the two lovers, whose destinies had been so intimately intertwined, their grand ambitions now utterly shattered. Soon after Antony's death, Octavian's forces breached Alexandria's defences, and Cleopatra was captured. She was brought before Octavian, who treated her with a cold, calculating courtesy, devoid of any genuine warmth or pity. Cleopatra, ever the queen, diplomat, and master of persuasion, attempted to negotiate with him, using all her renowned charm, intelligence, and strategic acumen. She hoped to secure a future for her children, particularly Caesarion, and perhaps even to retain some semblance of power or a client kingdom for herself under Roman suzerainty. She presented him with lists of her treasures, attempting to impress him with her wealth and her willingness to cooperate, perhaps hoping to appeal to his pragmatism. However, Octavian's intentions were clear, unyielding, and absolute. He had no desire to allow Cleopatra to continue ruling Egypt, as its wealth and strategic importance were too great to leave in the hands of a potentially rebellious foreign monarch. Nor did he intend to leave any potential rival to his claim as Caesar's heir alive. Caesarion, as Julius Caesar's biological son, represented a direct threat to Octavian's adopted lineage and legitimacy. Octavian's ultimate goal was to annex Egypt as a Roman province, transforming its wealth and grain supply into a direct asset for Rome, and crucially, to parade Cleopatra herself in his triumphal procession through the streets of Rome. This public humiliation, a common and highly symbolic fate for defeated enemies in Roman tradition, would serve as a powerful and visible symbol of his victory, the end of the civil wars, and the complete subjugation of the East. Cleopatra, with her keen understanding of Roman customs, Octavian's unyielding resolve, and the dire implications of being paraded as a captive, quickly realized her inescapable fate. She understood that being dragged through the streets of Rome, a spectacle for the conquering general's triumph, would be the ultimate indignity, a desecration of her royal dignity and the ancient lineage of the pharaohs she represented. To avoid this humiliation, and to ensure that she would not be a living trophy in Octavian's triumph, she made the courageous and final decision to take her own life. According to the most famous accounts, she achieved this by allowing herself to be bitten by an asp, a venomous Egyptian cobra, a death that carried strong symbolic significance in Egyptian religion, linking her to divinity and ensuring a dignified passage into the afterlife, rather than a shameful public display. Her death, in August 30 BC, marked the definitive end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek line that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, and indeed, the last independent Hellenistic kingdom that had emerged from Alexander's empire. Octavian, now the undisputed master of the Roman world, wasted no time in consolidating his victory. He ordered the immediate execution of Caesarion, eliminating any potential threat to his adopted lineage from Julius Caesar, and ensuring his own sole claim to the legacy. Cleopatra's other children by Antony were spared and brought to Rome, where they were raised by Octavia, Antony's former wife and Octavian's sister, but their royal lineage was effectively extinguished, and they never posed a threat to Roman power. Egypt, with its vast agricultural wealth, its strategic location, and its great cultural heritage, was formally annexed as a Roman province. It was governed directly by an appointee of the emperor, rather than by the Senate, underscoring its unique and vital importance to the new Roman imperial order. The ancient land of the pharaohs, which had maintained a distinct identity for millennia, now became a mere granary for Rome, its destiny irrevocably tied to the burgeoning Roman Empire, marking the true dawn of a new imperial age. The death of Cleopatra VII, in August 30 BC, marked not only the end of her remarkable life and the tragic conclusion of her personal story, but also the definitive close of an entire epoch, the Hellenistic Age, which had begun some 3 centuries earlier with the sweeping conquests of Alexander the Great. With Egypt, the last independent Hellenistic kingdom that had emerged from the fragmentation of Alexander's immense empire, now firmly annexed as a Roman province, the entire Mediterranean world was finally and irrevocably under Roman control. This monumental shift ushered in a new epoch, the Roman Empire, with Octavian, soon to be known as Augustus, consolidating his power as its first undisputed emperor. The political fragmentation and the internecine wars that had followed Alexander's death were now replaced by a new, centralized imperial power, drawing the resources of Egypt directly into Rome's coffers, providing the grain and wealth that would fuel the new empire for centuries. Cleopatra's story, however, did not fade into obscurity with her death. Instead, it began its long and complex journey into myth, legend, and enduring fascination. The Roman victors, particularly Octavian and his highly effective propagandists, immediately set about shaping her narrative to serve their own political ends. She was often portrayed in Roman literature and public discourse as a dangerous, exotic, and seductive temptress who had corrupted the noble Roman Mark Antony, a foreign queen who threatened the very foundations of the Republic and Roman virtue. This negative portrayal served a crucial purpose. It legitimized Octavian's victory, framing his triumph as a righteous defense of Roman values against an Eastern threat, and helped to solidify the new imperial order. Yet, Even within these often biased Roman accounts, her intelligence, charisma, and undeniable political acumen shone through, contributing to her enduring fascination and ensuring that her story would not be easily forgotten. Through the subsequent centuries, her image continued to evolve, becoming a powerful and recurring subject for literature, art, and drama across the Western world. Roman historians like Plutarch, in his Parallel Lives, and Cassius Dio, in his Roman History, provided detailed, if sometimes moralizing or politically motivated accounts that form the foundational basis of later interpretations. In the European Renaissance, she was rediscovered as a figure of tragic romance, exotic allure, and great power, inspiring poets and painters. It was William Shakespeare's magnificent play, Antony and Cleopatra, written in the early 17th century, that perhaps most cemented her image in the Western imagination, depicting her as a passionate, ambitious, and ultimately tragic queen, forever linked to her Roman lovers and the grand sweep of imperial destiny. Later, she would inspire countless operas, ballets, paintings, sculptures, and films, from the neoclassical period to modern Hollywood, with each generation reinterpreting her story through its own cultural lens, reflecting contemporary anxieties and fascinations with power, gender, and exoticism. Her enduring image today is a complex and often contradictory blend of historical fact and powerful, pervasive myth. She is remembered as a queen of great intelligence, strategic political skill, and an extraordinary capacity for leadership. She was a polyglot who could command respect and engage in sophisticated discourse in any language, and a ruler who fought fiercely, with every fibre of her being, to preserve her ancient kingdom's independence against overwhelming odds. Simultaneously, she is often depicted as a figure of irresistible beauty and seductive power, a woman capable of bending the most powerful men to her will through charm and allure. While the historical Cleopatra was undoubtedly a formidable politician and strategist, a pragmatic ruler focused on the survival of her dynasty, the romanticized aspects of her legend have often overshadowed the practical and political realities of her reign, creating a figure who transcends mere history. Her legacy, therefore, is not merely the end of a dynasty or the annexation of a province into a larger empire. It is the lasting and powerful impact of her narrative on the Western imagination, a testament to the enduring power of a story that combines high political ambition, intense personal drama, and the monumental clash of civilizations. She remains a compelling symbol of ancient Egypt's final, brilliant flourish before its absorption into a larger, dominant empire, a queen whose life, though tragically cut short, continues to resonate with a quiet, powerful echo across the millennia, inviting contemplation on the nature of power, love, and destiny in the ancient world. The great river Nile, ancient and unchanging, continues its slow, deliberate journey northward, carrying the rich silt of the land towards the sea, as it has for uncounted ages, a silent witness to the rise and fall of countless civilizations. The vast desert stretches silently to the east and west, its endless dunes sculpted by the patient hand of the wind, holding the secrets of forgotten dynasties and the whispers of ancient lives beneath its shifting sands. In the distance, the quiet ruins of Alexandria, once a bustling center of knowledge and power, stand as weathered monuments, their grand stones warmed by the setting sun, their magnificent designs softened and worn by the relentless elements, yet still hinting at past glories. The echoes of a vibrant court, of whispered intrigues and grand pronouncements, of the laughter and sorrow of queens and emperors, have long since faded into the gentle hum of memory, carried on the desert breeze. The voices of scholars and soldiers, of merchants and common people, have softened into the quiet chambers of recollection, becoming part of the vast collective dream of humanity's past, a tapestry woven from countless threads of lives lived and forgotten, each contributing to the silent narrative of time. The ambitions that once drove men and women to reshape continents, the alliances that shifted like desert sands, the triumphs that seemed to touch the heavens, and the sorrows that weighed upon the heart, all now rest within the quiet, encompassing embrace of history. As the final light of day recedes entirely, giving way to the full, tranquil embrace of the night sky, a sense of peace descends upon these ancient landscapes. The stories, once immediate and urgent, now linger as faint vibrations in the deep silence of the historical record, like distant stars whose light takes millennia to reach us. All that remains is the vast, silent expanse of time, stretching endlessly forward and backward, and the soft, steady rhythm of the earth beneath a canopy of innumerable stars, each one a distant, quiet reminder of the enduring universe and the fleeting, yet resonant passage of human lives within it. There comes a point when the events have been told, and what remains is the shape they leave behind. In Cleopatra's life, those shapes are still clear. The rooms she walked through, the light she saw on the river, the air she breathed before speaking words that would be remembered. The years are full of such moments, and they do not fade. She had walked into Julius Caesar's presence in Alexandria, with the scent of oil lamps, heavy in the air. The light wavered against the walls, moving gently with each shift of the flame. Outside, the river carried its slow current toward the sea, and the sound of it followed her into the chamber. Every detail of the space was fixed in her mind. The surface of the table between them, the rhythm of his breathing as he waited for her to speak. When she came to Rome, the city's stone streets seemed to draw the sun into themselves. The gardens where she walked with Caesar smelled of rosemary and dust warmed through the day. Voices from the road below rose and fell with the passing of carts, the sound of metal striking stone. The air moved differently there, carrying less of the sea and more of the inland earth. The sight of the Pharos lighthouse from the deck of her returning ship was a signal that she was home. Its flame glowed above the harbour walls, steady against the sky. She felt the tide lift and release the hull beneath her feet, heard the calls of the harbour workers over the wash of water. The palace rose ahead, its pale stone touched with the colour of the setting sun. Meeting Mark Antony for the first time, the sound of music from her barge reached the shore before she did. The water reflected the gold along the prow, and the air smelled of incense drifting in slow trails behind her. The late sun shone against the armour at his shoulder, the reflection shifting as he moved. When they spoke, her voice carried easily across the space between them, the harbour's sounds falling away until only their words remained. There were evenings in the palace gardens when she and Antony walked among the pomegranate trees, the air warm and still. The harbour lay dark beyond the walls, the masts of ships standing against the faint light of the sky. The sound of water against stone reached them at intervals, as though carried by an unseen hand. Before Actium, her tent was lit by a single lamp. The fabric walls moved with the night wind, and the ropes creaked with the pull of the tide. Maps lay open on the table, the inked coastlines as familiar to her as the folds of her own palm. The murmur of the camp came from beyond the canvas, low and steady. In Alexandria, after the fleet returned, she crossed the marble floors of the colonnade. The air was warm, but the stone beneath her sandals held the cool of the night. The shadow of the Pharos stretched toward the palace wall, its length telling the hour more clearly than any water clock. The great hall, emptied after an audience, seemed to hold the voices of the day within its walls. The carved throne stood at the centre, its rich fabrics unmoved by the air. She would stand there in the quiet, looking out over the patterned stone beneath her feet. In her upper rooms, the city spread out toward the harbour. She could trace the streets to the gates, each one known to her from childhood. The rooftops glowed in the angled light, and the line of the sea beyond was a calm band of colour. These were the moments that stayed when the noise of the day had gone. The scent of oil in a lamp, the feel of marble under her hand, the sound of water against the quay. They were the frame around the larger turns of her life, the unchanging shapes that held her days in place. Cleopatra lived among them always, and they remain with her still. The city of Alexandria spread outward from the palace in patterns that shifted with the seasons. In the warm months, the markets filled the streets with colour and sound, vendors calling out in voices shaped by the coast winds. Carts rolled over the stone roads, their wooden wheels carrying the smell of the grain they bore. The harbour held ships from every direction, sails rising and falling with the tide, their masts cutting into the pale sky. From the palace terraces, the sounds of the city arrived, softened by distance. The cry of gulls over the breakwater, the thud of crates lowered to the docks, the faint ring of a hammer on metal, the smell of fish from the morning catch would mingle with the sharp scent of resin from the shipwrights' yards, where new hulls waited to be pushed toward the sea. Along the waterfront, the water shifted in constant movement, catching the sunlight in broken flashes. Small boats wove between the larger vessels, their oars dipping and lifting in steady rhythm. Children ran along the quay, weaving between piles of rope and nets drying in the heat. Farther out, the Pharos lighthouse stood against the horizon, its base surrounded by the wash of the waves, its flame a signal for all who approached. Beyond the city walls, the fields began, long stretches of cultivated earth, bordered by palm groves. Channels of water ran between them, glinting under the sun. The air there carried the scent of damp soil and growing plants, the work of the flood season still visible in the ridges left by retreating water. Farmers moved slowly across the land, bent to their tasks, their figures marked by the steady pace of work that changed little from one year to the next. The Nile wound its way northward, its surface marked by the paths of barges and fishing boats. The reed beds along the shore rustled with the wind, and herons stood motionless in the shallows. The river's banks were alive with movement, washerwomen beating cloth against flat stones, men hauling water in clay jars, animals driven down to drink. From the deck of a passing boat, the landscape would appear as a series of small scenes, each fading into the next as the current carried the vessel forward. In the heat of midday, the city drew inward. Curtains were pulled across doorways, and the streets grew quieter, the sound of footsteps replaced by the rustle of cloth in the wind. In shaded courtyards, fountains continued their slow trickle, the water catching small flecks of light as it fell into stone basins. The smell of baking bread drifted from ovens, tucked into narrow lanes, the loaves stacked in baskets lined with linen. The temples stood in their measured stillness, their columns casting deep shadows, even in the brightest sun. Within, the air was cool, carrying the faint scent of incense from offerings laid earlier in the day. In the inner chambers, the light thinned to a pale glow, revealing the edges of carved figures and painted symbols along the walls. The sound of footsteps on the flagstones echoed faintly, and then was gone. In the gardens near the palace, the air changed with the hours. Morning brought the fresh scent of watered earth, the leaves bright with dew. By afternoon, the sun had warmed the stone paths, and the flowers leaned toward its heat. The fountains there kept their quiet movement, their sound carrying only a short distance before being absorbed by the thick greenery. At dusk, the air cooled, and the fragrance of certain blooms deepened, filling the narrow walks between hedges. The markets at day's end took on a different rhythm. The calls of the sellers became more urgent, the last of the day's goods held up for inspection. Torches flared along the stalls, their light striking the bronze and copper of weighing scales. Cloth in every hue hung in folds from wooden frames, moving slightly in the night breeze. The smell of cooked meat and spices lingered in the air, mingling with the sharper scent of smoke from the cooking fires. From the upper streets, one could look down toward the harbour and see the shifting lights of ships at anchor. Lanterns swayed on the decks, their reflections moving on the dark water. The sound of voices carried up from the shore, some calling across the water, others in low tones from figures gathered near the moorings. The sea itself lay beyond, its surface marked only by the faint shimmer of moonlight. In the cooler months, the wind off the water had an edge to it, carrying the tang of salt through the narrow streets. The markets were smaller then, the produce limited to what could be stored or preserved. The fields beyond the city rested, their soil dark and damp from the flood's retreat, the first shoots of the next season just beginning to show. The river moved on at its usual pace, its banks lined with bare branches and the pale gold of winter reeds. The palace remained a constant presence through all of it. Its walls caught the changing light of day, from the gold of dawn to the deep red of evening. The sound of the city never quite reached the inner rooms, though the air carried traces of it. The faintest note of sea wind, the warmth of the sun that had touched the streets outside. From its highest points, one could see the sweep of the coastline, the meeting of river and sea, the dark line where the water met the sky. All these things formed the shape of the world that held her, the city's streets and harbour, the fields and the river, the endless turn of the seasons. They moved on whether watched or not, their rhythm steady, their presence certain. In their constancy lay the foundation on which every day of her reign was built, and in their details was written the life of Alexandria itself. The air moved softly across the water, carrying with it the faint scent of distant earth. Light touched the surface in shifting fragments, as though it had been scattered before reaching it. A bird crossed the horizon in a slow arc, its wings catching the sun for a moment before folding into shadow. The sound of its flight faded quickly, replaced by the low murmur of water against stone. Along the shore, The wind traced patterns in the sand, each curve erased and redrawn in quiet succession. Small shells lay half buried, their colours muted by the light. The edge of the water advanced and retreated without pause, its rhythm steady, its voice unchanged. Stones worn smooth by time rested in uneven lines, the spaces between them filled with dark threads of seaweed. Farther inland, the ground rose gently, covered in the pale green of new growth. A narrow path wound upward, its surface pressed flat by many passing feet. The air was warmer there, touched by the scent of leaves in the sun. Shadows shifted slowly across the path, the branches above swaying in a pattern too slight to notice until it changed. Beyond the rise, a stretch of open ground lay under the full weight of the sky. The grass there bent with the wind, each blade leaning and lifting in turn. The sound of it was like the distant rush of water, soft and constant. Small insects moved between the stems, their movement visible only when the light caught the brief glint of a wing. A cluster of stones stood in the middle distance, their surfaces marked with lines worn deep. Lichen spread across them in muted shades, clinging to every curve and hollow. The ground around them held the pale remains of last season's growth, the stalks dry and brittle underfoot. The air cooled as the day began to turn. The light shifted toward gold, deepening the shadows, softening the edges of the land. The sound of the wind dropped lower, the movement of the grass slower now. In the far distance, the line of the horizon blurred, the shapes there dissolving into a haze that hid their detail. Small pools of water caught the changing light, their surfaces reflecting both sky and earth in a single frame. Ripples spread across them when the breeze returned, the patterns crossing and fading without trace. Around the edges, reeds swayed with a slow, measured grace, their tips bending in unison. In the fading light, the air took on the scent of cool stone and damp soil. The sky above began to gather colour, the pale blue shifting toward the first hints of deeper shades. The movement of birds became more deliberate, their paths turning toward unseen roosts. The last warmth of the day held to the earth for a time before yielding to the coming night. Shadows grew long across the open ground. The stones in the distance seemed to draw closer as the light dimmed, their forms sharpening in the contrast. The sound of the wind rose again, carrying with it the rustle of leaves and the faint clatter of something unseen. The air cooled further, and the first stars began to show. The water at the shore darkened until it reflected only the faintest traces of the sky. The tide continued its slow pull, advancing and retreating as it had before. In the quiet between waves, the sound of the wind through the reeds seemed louder, filling the space until the water returned. Somewhere inland, the path lay in shadow now, the branches above no longer moving. The scent of the air had changed again, holding the faint sharpness that comes with nightfall. The ground was cool underfoot, the shapes of stones and roots clearer to the touch than to the eye. As the night deepened, the pools of water stilled completely, their surfaces smooth enough to hold the reflection of the stars. The reeds around them stood motionless, their earlier movement held in memory. The sound of the wind eased, leaving only the softest trace of its passing. The land rested then, the shapes within it fading to outlines against the darker sky. The tide moved on, in its endless measure. The air rose and fell with the breath of the earth, and the quiet became complete. There is a sense of something moving, and then stilling, and then moving again, without hurry. The air folds into itself, rising and falling in long, unmeasured intervals. A thread of sound begins somewhere beyond hearing, draws closer, and then fades, as if it had never been there at all. The quiet that follows is not empty. It carries a weight, a slow turning that continues even when unnoticed. Somewhere in the distance there is a pulse, softer than a breath, a faint vibration that reaches the edges of awareness and then slips away. It returns again, a little slower, as though circling in a wider arc. Between each return, there is space that opens and then closes again, the edges folding inward, without a sound. The air changes with no clear cause. A coolness passes through, lingers for a moment, and is gone. In its absence, there is something warmer, a fullness that spreads and then thins. It is impossible to mark the point where one becomes the other, only that the change has already happened by the time it is felt. Light, if it is light at all, seems to gather and dissolve without direction. There is no source to follow, no place where it begins or ends. It drifts, shifting from one shade to another, without line or form. It rests for a time in a pale glow, then softens, then deepens again, until even the difference between glow and shadow is unclear. Somewhere, a sound stirs. It is neither near nor far, only present for a few moments before being carried off. It might be the movement of air, or the faint settling of something unseen. It leaves behind an impression that lingers longer than the sound itself. Time moves here in ways that cannot be measured. A moment stretches until it feels without end, and then, without warning, it releases and flows into another. Each moment holds within it the echo of the one before, yet they do not press against each other. They are connected by something softer than memory, something more fluid than thought. There is a sense of depth without shape. The space feels wide, then close, then wide again, as though breathing in and out. At times it seems to lean forward, as if approaching, then eases back until it becomes part of the background once more. A trace of sound passes through, layered so faintly, it could be mistaken for silence. It twists in a slow spiral, before straightening into a line, then dissolves. In its absence, the space feels different, though nothing has changed. Somewhere, there may be motion, the faint suggestion of something turning, or drifting, or folding over itself. It is impossible to tell if it is small or vast, near or beyond reach. It appears for a breath and then is gone, leaving only the awareness that it was there. The air holds a quiet weight, as though it rests in the pause before something begins. That pause lengthens, stretching into the sense that it may never end. When change does come, it is barely felt, a shift so gradual, it feels as though it has always been there. The sound returns, softer than before, moving in a pattern that cannot be traced. It touches the edges of hearing, and then falls away, replaced by another tone, lower, slower, almost too faint to follow. The two tones blend for a moment, and then there is only one again, and then none. A faint vibration passes through the stillness, so slight it might be imagined. It lingers at the edge of awareness, neither growing nor fading, until it simply is not there anymore. The absence it leaves feels larger than the sound itself had been. There is no direction here, no above or below, no before or after, only the slow unfolding of something that does not need to be named. The movement within it is not progress, but a turning, a return to where it began, without ever quite repeating. Another sound moves through, longer this time, drawn out until it thins into silence. The space it leaves is softer, as though the sound had taken some of its weight with it. The silence grows warmer for a while, then cooler again, without pause or reason. The light shifts again, but not in colour or strength, only in the way it feels on the edge of perception. It seems to fold over itself, wrapping and unwrapping in slow measure, until it is no longer certain whether it is lighter to reach.